The morning sun cast long shadows across Naval Air Station Oceana when Lieutenant Commander Raven Ghostwing Kozlowski first noticed the anomaly. Her FA-18E Super Hornet sat gleaming on the tarmac, but something felt wrong. The pre-flight checklist she'd memorized through countless deployments suddenly seemed foreign in her hands. For 3 weeks, whispers had followed her through the ready room corridors. Sideways glances from pilots she'd flown alongside for years. Questions about her training run that felt more like interrogations. The mystery deepened when she discovered her flight recorder data from the previous month had been pulled by naval intelligence. No explanation, no formal inquiry, just missing files and a growing sense that someone believed she was hiding something. The irony wasn't lost on her. After 12 years of exemplary service, 3 combat deployments and a distinguished flying cross, they questioned her loyalty now. But Raven had survived worse than whispered accusations. She'd survived losing her wingman over Syria, survived the crash that left shrapnel in her left shoulder, survived being told she was too small, too emotional, too female for fighter aviation. What she couldn't understand was why her routine training flight from 2 months ago had triggered such intense scrutiny. It had been a standard navigation exercise, a simple run from Virginia Beach to the Outer Banks and back. Weather had been clear, communications normal, mission parameters met exactly. Yet somehow, that flight had set off alarms that reached all the way to SEAL Team 6. The answer came in fragments. First, an encrypted message from her former squadron mate, Commander Marcus Bulldog Reeves, now serving with Naval Special Warfare Development Group. "Check your GPS logs from 15 October, was all it said. Then, a chance encounter with Chief Petty Officer Elena Vasquez in the base commissary. "They're asking questions about your family," Vasquez had whispered, her usual easy smile replaced by concern. "Specifically about your grandmother." Raven's blood had turned cold at that moment. Her grandmother, Katia Kozlowski, had died 3 years ago, taking her stories of the old country with her. Stories Raven had always assumed were the embellished memories of an aging immigrant woman. Stories about codes and signals and a life before America that Katia had never fully explained. Now, sitting in her cockpit as dawn broke over the Atlantic, Raven began to understand that her past and her present were about to collide in ways she'd never imagined. The flight recorder might have captured more than just her routine training run. It might have captured something that had been dormant for decades, waiting for the right person, the right moment, the right flight path to awaken it. The engines of her Super Hornet hummed with restrained power as she prepared for what might be the most important mission of her career, even though officially it wasn't a mission at all. Lieutenant Commander Raven Kozlowski had earned her call sign, Ghostwing, during her first deployment to the Persian Gulf, when she'd managed to evade 3 enemy radar installations during a reconnaissance mission that should have been impossible. Her commanding officer later said she'd moved through the sky like a ghost, leaving no trace except the intelligence she'd gathered. The name stuck, though few knew the full story behind it. Born in Baltimore to Polish immigrants, Raven had grown up in a household where hard work and resilience were the only currencies that mattered. Her father, Stefan, worked double shifts at the shipyard. Her mother, Maria, cleaned offices downtown until her hands cracked from the industrial soap. But it was her paternal grandmother, Katia, who had shaped Raven's understanding of duty and sacrifice. Katia rarely spoke about her life before coming to America in 1962, but when she did, her stories carried the weight of someone who had seen history's darkest chapters. She would sit with young Raven on the front porch of their East Baltimore row house, pointing to constellations and explaining how the stars had guided travelers long before GPS existed. "Navigation is more than following instruments," she would say in her thick accent. "Sometimes you must trust what lives in your blood." Those words echoed in Raven's mind now, as she taxied toward runway 5L. The investigation into her flight pattern had revealed something that made her grandmother's cryptic lessons suddenly relevant. According to the classified briefing she'd finally been read into, Her October 15th training run had traced an almost perfect match to a Cold War-era courier route, one that had been used to pass intelligence between Polish resistance contacts and American handlers. The route had been dormant since 1963, archived in files that most people assumed would never see daylight again. Yet somehow, following standard navigation waypoints for a routine training exercise, Raven had flown the exact same pattern her grandmother might have used to communicate with the West more than 60 years ago. Tower, Ghostwing requesting clearance for departure. She called into her helmet microphone, her voice steady despite the churning in her stomach. Ghostwing Tower, you are cleared for takeoff. Runway 5L contact departure on 121.1. The FA-18E's twin General Electric F-414 engines roared to life, pressing her back into her ejection seat as 22,000 pounds of thrust launched her into the Virginia morning. Below, the Chesapeake Bay spread out like burnished metal, its surface broken by the wakes of fishing boats and cargo vessels going about their ordinary business, unaware that the aircraft passing overhead carried the weight of decades-old secrets. At 15,000 feet, Raven leveled off and engaged autopilot, allowing herself a moment to process everything she'd learned in the past 72 hours. The SEAL team questioning her loyalty hadn't been acting on suspicion, they'd been acting on recognition. The morning briefing had been unlike anything in her 12-year career. Commander Reeves had appeared at her apartment at 500, accompanied by two men in civilian clothes who introduced themselves only as government analysts. The conversation that followed had rewritten everything she thought she knew about her family's history. Your grandmother wasn't just a Polish immigrant, Raven, Reeves had said, his usually jovial demeanor replaced by the gravity of someone delivering classified intelligence. Katia Kozlowski was one of the most effective intelligence assets the CIA had in Eastern Europe during the late 1950s and early 1960s. She passed information that helped prevent at least 3 major Soviet operations against NATO installations. The revelation had hit her like turbulence at altitude, sudden, disorienting, making her question everything she thought she understood about her trajectory through life. Katia, who had made pierogi every Sunday and taught her to play chess on a board missing half its pieces, had been a spy. The route you flew on October 15th, one of the analysts had continued, matches a courier path she used to signal her American handlers. We'd assumed all knowledge of that route died with the generation that used it. Your flight pattern suggests otherwise. Now, climbing through 20,000 feet with the Atlantic Ocean stretching endlessly to her right, Raven began to understand why the SEALs had questioned her loyalty. In their world, coincidences like this didn't exist. When someone unknowingly replicated a classified intelligence route with precision that suggested inside knowledge, it raised red flags that reached the highest levels of national security. But Raven knew something the investigators didn't yet fully grasp. Her flight path hadn't been coincidental at all. It had been instinctive. Following the waypoints that morning, she'd felt drawn to make minor course corrections that brought her precisely onto the old courier route. At the time, she'd attributed the feeling to her grandmother's old lessons about trusting navigation instincts. Now she realized those instincts might have been inherited knowledge, passed down through family stories that seemed like folklore but contained operational truth. The radio crackled with routine traffic control communications, but underneath the familiar chatter, Raven could hear the tension that had infected her unit since the investigation began. Her squadron mates were professional enough to maintain proper radio discipline, but their voices carried subtle changes that spoke of broken trust and uncertain loyalties. These were men and women she'd flown combat missions with, people who had trusted her with their lives at 30,000 feet over hostile territory. Now they weren't sure what to believe about the pilot they'd known as Ghostwing. The irony was crushing. She'd earned their respect through competence and courage, proving herself repeatedly in a community that didn't easily accept outsiders. Her first squadron commander had made it clear that female pilots would need to work twice as hard for half the recognition. She'd accepted that challenge, excelling in every metric that mattered: weapons accuracy, tactical knowledge, leadership under pressure. But respect built over years could be undermined in days when national security questions arose. The same instincts that made her an exceptional pilot, her ability to read subtle patterns, trust her judgment over instruments when necessary, navigate by intuition as much as technology, now made her seem potentially compromised. Ghostwing, this is departure. Contact Washington Center on 124.85. Washington Center, 124.85 Ghostwing. The frequency change marked more than just a handoff to the next air traffic controller. It marked her transition from the familiar airspace around her home base into territory where every decision would be scrutinized, every course correction analyzed for hidden meaning. From now until this investigation concluded, she would be flying under a microscope, with careers and national security implications hanging on her every move. 25 miles southeast of Virginia Beach, Raven reached her first waypoint and began a gentle turn toward the coordinates that had started this entire controversy. Her flight management system showed the route as a series of numbered waypoints connected by straight lines, clinical, mathematical, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know the history those numbers represented. But as she settled onto the heading that would take her along the old courier route, Raven felt the same inexplicable pull she'd experienced 2 months ago. It was as if the aircraft wanted to fly this particular path, as if 60 years of radio silence had been waiting for someone with the right blood, the right instincts, the right combination of skill and heritage to reactivate a dormant link between past and present. The FA-18E responded to her control inputs with the precision of a finely tuned instrument, but Raven knew that precision alone wouldn't be enough to navigate whatever lay ahead. She would need to trust the lessons her grandmother had taught her about reading between the lines, about understanding that the most important communications often happened in the spaces between words, in the silences that spoke louder than any radio transmission. Below her, the Atlantic Ocean stretched toward a horizon that held answers she wasn't sure she was ready to discover. Commander Marcus "Bulldog" Reeves had known Raven Kozlowski since her first day at flight school, and he'd never seen her rattled by anything the Navy could throw at her. Reeves himself was now embedded with SEAL Team 6, serving as their aviation liaison for operations that didn't officially exist. His office in the Naval Special Warfare Development Group compound was lined with mission patches from places the public would never hear about, commemorating victories that would remain classified for decades. But this morning, reviewing the intelligence files spread across his desk, even Reeves felt the weight of secrets that stretched back to his childhood. The courier route that Raven had unknowingly flown had been part of Operation Nightingale, a Cold War intelligence network that had ended abruptly in 1963 with the assassination of President Kennedy. Most of the files had been sealed, the assets relocated or retired, the communication methods abandoned. Until 48 hours ago, when Lieutenant Commander Raven Kozlowski had proven that some knowledge transcended official records. "Sir, we have the preliminary analysis from the October 15th flight," Chief Petty Officer Vasquez announced, entering his office with a tablet that displayed flight tracking data overlaid with historical intelligence maps. The correlation was impossible to dismiss. Raven's flight path matched the Nightingale courier route with 97.3% accuracy, a statistical impossibility without prior knowledge of the specific coordinates and timing intervals that had made the route functional during the Cold War. "Any word from the investigation team?" Reeves asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "They're divided, sir. Half think she's been compromised by a foreign intelligence service. The other half think she's inherited knowledge she doesn't understand." Reeves nodded grimly. Both possibilities carried implications that reached far beyond one pilot's career. If Raven had been compromised, it suggested that hostile intelligence services had deeper knowledge of historical U.S. operations than anyone had imagined. If she'd inherited knowledge, it meant that classified information had been passed down through family channels for decades without detection. Either scenario represented a massive intelligence failure. But Reeves had flown with Raven through 3 deployments, and he'd seen her make split-second decisions under enemy fire that saved American lives. His instincts told him that whatever was happening here went deeper than compromise or coincidence. It felt like destiny, though that wasn't a word that appeared in official Navy intelligence reports. The secure phone on his desk buzzed with an encrypted call from Naval Intelligence Headquarters. The investigation was about to enter a new phase. At flight level 250, Raven's Super Hornet sliced through air so clear she could see individual whitecaps on the ocean surface 25,000 feet below. The autopilot maintained her course with mechanical precision, but her hands remained light on the controls, ready to take manual command if her instincts suggested a deviation from the programmed route. Those instincts were what worried the investigators, and Raven was beginning to understand why. Following this particular flight path felt less like navigation and more like coming home, a sensation that should have been impossible for coordinates she'd never flown before her October training mission. Ghostwing, Washington Center. Traffic 2 o'clock, 5 miles northbound, flight level 230. Washington Center, Ghostwing, traffic in sight. The commercial airliner passed safely below and to her right, its passengers presumably unaware that they were sharing airspace with a pilot whose family history had just reopened a Cold War intelligence case that most officials assumed had been permanently closed. Raven's helmet-mounted display showed her approaching waypoint Charlie, the 3rd coordinate in the historical courier sequence. According to the classified briefing, this was where Katia Kozlowski would have transmitted coded weather reports that contained intelligence about Soviet submarine movements in the North Atlantic. The irony wasn't lost on Raven that she was now flying the same route in an aircraft designed to detect and engage those same types of submarines. As she crossed the waypoint, her radio receiver picked up a faint transmission on a frequency that wasn't part of her flight plan. The signal lasted only 3 seconds, too brief to be routine air traffic control, too structured to be atmospheric interference. Washington Center, Ghostwing. Did you copy a transmission on 243.7 at my location? Ghostwing, Washington Center. Negative on any transmissions on that frequency. The response confirmed what Raven had suspected. Whatever she'd heard wasn't part of normal aviation communications. It was something else, something that had been waiting for the right aircraft, on the right route, at the right time to become audible again. She made a mental note to report the transmission during her post-flight debrief, knowing that it would add another layer of complexity to an investigation that was already challenging everything the Navy thought it knew about operational security and information control. The weight of her grandmother's legacy pressed down on her like G-forces during a high-performance turn. Katia had carried secrets that she'd never fully revealed, but somehow those secrets had found their way into Raven's blood, her instincts, her unconscious decision-making process. The old woman who had seemed like just another immigrant grandmother making the best of a new life had actually been one of the most effective intelligence assets of her generation. The investigation team would be analyzing every aspect of Raven's family history now, looking for evidence of how classified information had been preserved and transmitted across decades. They would interview distant relatives, examine family photographs, trace communication patterns that might reveal ongoing intelligence activities. But Raven suspected they wouldn't find what they were looking for in obvious places. Katia had been too professional for that. The secrets had been hidden in plain sight, in bedtime stories that seemed like folklore, in navigation lessons that appeared to be simple life advice, in chess games that taught tactical thinking without revealing their true purpose. The realization that her entire childhood had been shaped by a grandmother who was living a carefully constructed cover story should have felt like betrayal. Instead, it felt like recognition. Every lesson about reading people, every story about trusting instincts over obvious answers, every quiet moment of shared understanding had been preparation for a role Raven had never known she was training to fill. Now, 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, she was beginning to understand that her career in naval aviation might have been less about personal choice and more about inherited duty. The same instincts that made her an exceptional pilot might have been cultivated for purposes that reached beyond military service into the shadows, where intelligence operations shaped global events. The question was whether she was ready to accept that responsibility, or whether the investigation would end her career before she could fully understand what she'd inherited from the grandmother who had taught her to navigate by the stars. Chief Petty Officer Elena Vasquez had spent 8 years with Naval Special Warfare, long enough to recognize when a routine investigation had evolved into something that would reshape how the Navy understood operational security. The file folders spread across the conference table contained evidence of the most sophisticated intelligence inheritance case in modern military history. Vasquez had been assigned to the investigation team because of her expertise in communication analysis and her security clearance for historical intelligence operations. What she hadn't expected was to find herself analyzing a case that challenged fundamental assumptions about how classified information could be preserved and transmitted across generations. "The pattern analysis is conclusive," she reported to the assembled team of investigators. "Lieutenant Commander Kozlowski's October 15th flight path matches the Operation Nightingale courier route with precision that exceeds our statistical models for coincidence." The room contained representatives from Naval Intelligence, the CIA, and SEAL Team 6, a collection of professionals who had seen enough classified operations to remain skeptical of easy explanations. But the evidence before them defied easy categorization. "What about family communications?" asked the CIA analyst, a woman who introduced herself only as Sarah from Langley. "Any indication that classified information was being actively transmitted within the family structure?" Vasquez shook her head. "That's what makes this case so unusual. We've found no evidence of ongoing intelligence activities within the Kozlowski family. No suspicious contacts, no unusual travel patterns, no financial irregularities that would suggest foreign intelligence involvement." "Then how do we explain the flight path correlation?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a classified operation gone wrong. In the intelligence community, unexplainable patterns usually indicated either sophisticated foreign penetration or massive failures in operational security. This case suggested a third possibility that didn't fit existing analytical frameworks. "There's something else," Vasquez continued, opening a folder marked with classifications that restricted access to fewer than 50 people in the entire U.S. government. "We've identified similar pattern correlations in other family members of historical intelligence assets." The revelation changed the atmosphere in the room from skeptical analysis to urgent concern. If classified information was being inherited through genetic or cultural channels across multiple intelligence families, it represented a security vulnerability that reached into the deepest levels of American intelligence operations. But it also represented an asset that could be more valuable than any technology the Navy possessed. Raven's Super Hornet reached Waypoint Delta as the morning sun climbed higher over the Atlantic, casting shadows that shifted with her aircraft's movement like a sundial marking time across decades of hidden history. This coordinate had particular significance in the Operation Nightingale files. It was where her grandmother would have received confirmation signals that her intelligence had been successfully received and processed by American handlers. The irony of flying this route in a 21st century fighter aircraft loaded with the most advanced surveillance and communication equipment in the world wasn't lost on Raven. 60 years ago, her grandmother had used basic radio equipment and coded weather reports to pass information that helped shape the outcome of the Cold War. Now Raven was flying the same route with technology that could detect a submarine at 50 miles and communicate instantly with command centers around the globe. Yet somehow, the old methods had proven more durable than anyone had imagined. Ghostwing, Washington Center. Contact Norfolk approach on 119.3. Norfolk approach, 119.3 Ghostwing. The frequency change brought her into communication range of her home base, but Raven knew that this flight would end differently than any routine training mission she'd ever flown. When she landed, there would be debriefing sessions that went far beyond normal flight operations. There would be questions about family history, about inherited knowledge, about loyalties that stretched across generations. But first, she needed to complete the route that had started this entire investigation. According to the historical files, there were 3 more waypoints in the Nightingale sequence, coordinates that would take her in a wide arc over the Atlantic before returning to the Virginia coast. As she adjusted course toward Waypoint Echo, her radar warning receiver detected a brief electronic emission from somewhere ahead of her flight path. The signal lasted only seconds, but it was enough to identify the source. A submarine electronic surveillance mast breaking the surface long enough to acquire her aircraft's radar signature. The detection should have been impossible. Her flight plan was classified, her route unpredictable to anyone without access to the historical Nightingale files. Yet something beneath the Atlantic Ocean was tracking her progress with precision that suggested advanced knowledge of her intentions. Raven's training kicked in automatically. She activated her electronic countermeasures system, altered course to present a more difficult targeting solution, and prepared to report the contact to Norfolk approach. But before she could transmit, her radio receiver picked up another brief signal on the same frequency she detected earlier. This time, the signal lasted long enough for her to recognize its structure. It wasn't random atmospheric interference. It was Morse code, transmitted on a frequency that had been assigned to Operation Nightingale more than 60 years ago. The message was brief but unmistakable. "Welcome home, Ghostwing." The transmission confirmed what Raven had begun to suspect during the investigation. Her grandmother's work with American intelligence hadn't ended with the official termination of Operation Nightingale. It had continued in some form, dormant but not dead, waiting for the right person with the right knowledge to reactivate a network that had been sleeping since the Kennedy administration. The question was whether that network served American interests or something else entirely. The submarine contact suggested that foreign intelligence services were aware of the Nightingale route and were actively monitoring anyone who attempted to fly it. But the Morse code welcome message suggested that friendly assets were also watching, ready to provide support or guidance if needed. Raven found herself at the center of an intelligence operation that predated her birth, but had somehow been waiting for her participation. The flight path that had seemed like routine training 2 months ago was revealing itself to be a test, one that would determine not only her loyalty, but her readiness to inherit a legacy that carried implications for national security at the highest levels. The weight of that responsibility should have been overwhelming. Instead, it felt like recognition. Every instinct that had made her an exceptional pilot, every lesson her grandmother had taught her about navigation and trust, every moment of training that had prepared her for this career had been leading to this flight, this discovery, this choice between the life she'd planned and the destiny she'd inherited. At 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, with electronic signals from unknown sources tracking her movement and classified frequencies carrying messages from the past, Lieutenant Commander Raven Ghostwing Kozlowski began to understand that her military career had been preparation for something much larger than routine naval aviation. The investigation would continue when she landed. There would be more questions, more analysis, more attempts to understand how classified information had survived across generations without leaving traces in official records. But the answers wouldn't be found in briefing rooms or security clearance investigations. They would be found in the sky, following routes that connected past and present through inherited knowledge that transcended normal intelligence channels. Her grandmother's legacy wasn't just family history. It was an operational asset that had been preserved for exactly this moment, when global tensions once again required the kind of invisible communication networks that had helped win the Cold War. The radio crackled with routine traffic control instructions, but underneath the familiar chatter, Raven could hear the whispers of history calling her toward a future that would be determined by her willingness to accept that some forms of service transcended official recognition or traditional understanding. She adjusted course toward the next waypoint, knowing that each degree of heading change was taking her deeper into a world where family loyalty and national security intersected in ways that would challenge everything the Navy thought it knew about operational control and information security. The investigation had started with questions about her loyalty. It was about to discover that her loyalty extended to purposes and people that official records had never been able to capture or contain. Commander Reeves monitored Raven's flight progress from the Naval Special Warfare Operations Center, where secure communications linked his team to intelligence assets around the globe. The submarine contact that Ghostwing had detected was already being analyzed by Navy intelligence, but the preliminary identification raised more questions than answers. The electronic signature matched a Russian Yasen-class attack submarine, but the positioning was unusual. Instead of conducting routine patrol operations, the submarine had been stationed precisely along the historical Operation Nightingale courier route, as if it had been waiting for someone to fly the pattern that Raven had unconsciously replicated. "Sir, we're getting reports of similar submarine activities in other areas where Nightingale assets operated during the 1960s, Chief Vasquez reported, her voice carrying the tension that came with classified information that didn't fit established threat assessment models. Reeves studied the global positioning data on his secure terminal. Russian submarines had been detected near historical intelligence sites off the coast of Norway, in the Mediterranean near former CIA communication points, and in the Pacific along routes that had been used to pass information about Soviet naval movements. The pattern suggested that foreign intelligence services had somehow gained access to Operation Nightingale files that were supposed to have been destroyed decades ago. But it also suggested that those files were incomplete. Otherwise, there would have been no need to position assets along the routes to monitor for renewed activity. "What's the assessment from Langley?" Reeves asked, though he suspected the CIA was as puzzled by these developments as everyone else. "They're scrambling to understand how classified route information from the 1960s could have been preserved and activated without triggering any of their monitoring systems," Vasquez replied. "The working theory is that we're seeing the activation of a sleeper network that was established during the Cold War but never officially documented." The possibility sent a chill through Reeves that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the secure facility. Undocumented intelligence networks represented the kind of operational security nightmare that kept senior officials awake at night. If such networks existed, they operated outside normal command structures and oversight mechanisms, making them virtually impossible to monitor or control. But they also represented capabilities that could prove invaluable in an era of increasing global tensions and sophisticated electronic surveillance. The same characteristics that made undocumented networks dangerous also made them incredibly effective for operations that required absolute secrecy. "How is Lieutenant Commander Kozlowski handling the situation?" he asked. Vasquez consulted her tablet before responding. Her radio communications remain professional, and her flight path continues to match the historical Nightingale route with remarkable precision. If she's experiencing stress from the submarine contact and the investigation, it's not showing in her performance. Reeves nodded with satisfaction but not surprise. He'd served with Raven long enough to know that she performed best under pressure, when the situation demanded the kind of instinctive decision-making that couldn't be taught in flight school or learned from manuals. What worried him was the possibility that she was performing too well, that her ability to navigate the current situation suggested preparation or knowledge that reached beyond her official training and experience. The secure phone buzzed with another encrypted communication from Washington. The investigation was about to enter a phase that would determine not only Raven's future, but the Navy's approach to intelligence operations that operated outside traditional command structures. Raven approached Waypoint Echo with the sun now high enough to eliminate the long shadows that had marked the beginning of her flight. The Atlantic stretched endlessly in all directions, its surface deceptively calm despite the electronic warfare being conducted beneath its waves and in the airspace above. Her radar warning receiver remained active, scanning for additional submarine contacts or aircraft that might be monitoring her progress. The Russian submarine she detected earlier had submerged and disappeared, but Raven knew it was still there, tracking her movement with passive sonar and electronic surveillance equipment that could monitor her radio communications and flight path without revealing its position. The knowledge that hostile forces were watching her every move should have been intimidating. Instead, it felt familiar, like a situation she'd trained for without realizing she was training. Her grandmother's stories about wartime navigation suddenly made sense in the context of operational security and electronic warfare. Ghostwing, Norfolk approach. Be advised, you have priority routing for your return to base. Contact Norfolk Tower on 118.5 when ready for approach. The priority routing meant that other aircraft would be directed away from her flight path, giving her clear access to Naval Air Station Oshina. But it also meant that her landing would be monitored by multiple agencies, and that her post-flight debriefing would involve people whose names she might never learn. Norfolk approach, Ghostwing copies priority routing. Will contact Tower on 118.5. As she began her turn toward the final waypoints of the Nightingale route, Raven's radio receiver picked up another transmission on the historical frequency. This time, the signal was longer and more complex, containing what appeared to be updated navigation coordinates and timing sequences. The transmission suggested that the dormant network her grandmother had been part of was not only still active, but was adapting to current conditions and operational requirements. Someone with access to the original Nightingale protocols was providing real-time updates that would make the historical routes functional for contemporary intelligence operations. The implications were staggering. If accurate, it meant that the United States had maintained an intelligence capability that operated completely outside official oversight for more than 60 years. It meant that classified information and operational methods had been preserved through family channels and personal relationships rather than through official records and institutional memory. It also meant that Raven's family background made her incredibly valuable to national security and incredibly dangerous to operational security if she chose to use her inherited knowledge for purposes that didn't align with American interests. The radio message had included what appeared to be a coded authentication request, a challenge that would verify whether she possessed the knowledge and authority to participate in whatever operation the dormant network was preparing to execute. Raven found herself facing a choice that would define not only her military career, but her role in intelligence operations that reached far beyond anything she'd learned at the Naval Academy or in flight training. She could report the transmission and let the official investigation process determine how to handle the situation. Or she could respond to the authentication challenge and accept responsibility for capabilities and knowledge that she was only beginning to understand. The decision carried risks that extended far beyond her personal future. If she responded incorrectly, she could compromise intelligence operations that had been protecting American interests for decades. If she responded correctly, she would be accepting a role in activities that might not have official authorization or oversight. But as she approached the coordinates where her grandmother had once risked her life to pass information that helped prevent Soviet attacks on NATO installations, Raven realized that some forms of service transcended official recognition or traditional command structures. The authentication challenge was waiting for her response. Her grandmother's legacy was waiting for her decision. And somewhere beneath the Atlantic Ocean, foreign intelligence assets were waiting to see whether Operation Nightingale would remain dormant or begin a new phase of activity that could reshape the balance of global intelligence operations. The sky around her seemed to hold its breath as she reached for the radio transmitter and prepared to answer a question that had been waiting 60 years for her response. The authentication response came naturally to Raven's lips, as if her grandmother's voice was guiding her through a protocol she'd learned in childhood without understanding its significance. The coded phrase that emerged from her radio combined Polish words her grandmother had taught her with numbers that corresponded to the date of President Kennedy's assassination, the event that had officially ended Operation Nightingale. Nightingale 77, Authentication Katia November 2263. Request operational guidance. The response was immediate, transmitted on a frequency so close to standard aviation communications that it would be invisible to anyone not specifically monitoring for historical intelligence protocols. Ghostwing Nightingale Control. Authentication confirmed. Welcome to the family. Proceed to final waypoint and await further instructions. The exchange confirmed what Raven had begun to suspect during the investigation. She wasn't just the granddaughter of a former intelligence asset. She was the designated heir to an operational capability that had been maintained in dormancy for 6 decades, waiting for global conditions and family succession to align for reactivation. The family reference carried implications that reached far beyond personal relationships. It suggested that Operation Nightingale had evolved from a government intelligence program into something more resembling a private network of families and individuals who shared inherited knowledge and mutual obligations that transcended official government service. Such networks existed in intelligence folklore, groups of families whose loyalty to American interests predated the establishment of formal intelligence agencies, whose knowledge had been passed down through generations of service that was never fully documented in official records. But folklore and reality had just intersected 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, with Lieutenant Commander Raven Kozlowski serving as the bridge between past and present, between official military service and inherited intelligence obligations. Her FA-18E Super Hornet responded to control inputs with mechanical precision, but Raven knew that the aircraft was now more than a Navy fighter. It had become a communication platform for an intelligence network that operated according to rules and protocols that existed outside normal military command structures. The final waypoint appeared on her navigation display as she completed the turn that would take her home to Naval Air Station Oshina. But home now carried multiple meanings: her official assignment as a Navy pilot, her inherited role as a Nightingale asset, and her position as the focal point of an investigation that would determine how the American intelligence community adapted to capabilities and threats that didn't fit existing analytical frameworks. Below her, the Atlantic Ocean concealed submarines from multiple nations, all monitoring for signs of intelligence activities that they understood imperfectly. Above her, surveillance satellites tracked her movement with sensors that could detect the heat signature of her engines, but couldn't penetrate the historical significance of her flight path. And around her, the sky itself seemed to carry the weight of secrets that connected her grandmother's courage during the Cold War to challenges that would define intelligence operations for the next generation of threats and opportunities. The radio remained quiet as Raven approached the final waypoint, but she could sense the attention focused on her aircraft from multiple sources, official investigators monitoring her compliance with the announced flight plan, intelligence analysts trying to understand the significance of pattern correlation that defied statistical explanation, and assets from the revived Nightingale network who were evaluating her readiness for responsibilities that had been waiting decades for her acceptance. The moment of truth was approaching. When she reached the final waypoint, she would need to make the definitive choice between reporting her radio contacts to official investigators or accepting guidance from the inherited network that claimed her as family. The choice would determine not only her personal future, but the evolution of American intelligence capabilities, in an era when traditional methods were increasingly vulnerable to electronic surveillance and foreign penetration.